Molding and casting a replica firearm. In this tutorial, we'll be covering the process of making a silicone mold of a firearm and then reproducing it in a casting material, either a hard casting resin like we'll do in this video, or also a flexible casting material or semi-rigid casting material. Now, molding a firearm presents some unique challenges, and we'll be covering those in this tutorial, as well as some unique configuration challenges and just overall speed of the process. Since typically this process is done for film or television, time is typically of the essence. So we'll show how to make a fast mold and a fast reproduction of a firearm using very basic, straightforward techniques. And at the end of the video, we'll cover some quick finishing tips as well. Now, to begin, we'll be using an airsoft firearm replica. Now, I know this is not a real firearm, but it does present some of the same challenges as far as a working slide and a removable magazine, and we're actually going to mold it with the barrel down. Now, we could also mold it with the magazine or the grip down, but that would create an area that would take more effort to sand. So and that would also create some areas in that hammer where it might trap some air bubbles. So by putting it barrel down like this, that allows the casting material to flow straight down. If you imagine this upside down, it allows the casting material to flow straight down and fill those areas, and then the bubbles can come straight up out of those areas. And we only need one vent right there on the edge of the magazine. Now, these replica airsoft pistols like this are ideal for prop making because if you destroy them in the mold making process, nobody loses any sleep over that. I think I paid about 15 or 16 bucks or so at a flea market for this. So these are easy to come by, and if you break them in the molding process, it's no big deal. If you are molding an actual firearm, really important to field strip it and pack the inside, all the springs and everything, full of petroleum jelly, just plain petroleum jelly. The reason for that is that will keep the petroleum jelly in the firearm, will keep the silicone from getting into the firearm. And you really want to avoid any silicone seeping into the firearm, because anywhere it does, it will destroy any springs or lock around any mechanical parts, and that will totally destroy a perfectly good weapon. So really important, if you're molding an actual firearm, take time to practice on something insignificant like a metal airsoft pistol first to hone your technique. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm going to sculpt with some Protolina clay. I'm going to sculpt a little pour spout, a little funnel shape around the barrel, where what I did is I ran a long wood screw up through this baseboard and then hot glued that in place in the barrel, and then I'm just sculpting a little funnel shape out around the barrel so that in reverse this will give me a little funnel to pour my casting material into. Now, this is where it's a good idea to have a good plan before you start any of the molding and casting process. We want to make sure we have a clear plan on how we're going to remove this weapon from the finished mold. So this is going to be poured in a block around this little pistol here, and we're going to give it about an inch of clearance on all sides and a little bit more on the top. And the reason for that is this is actually going to be cut up from the barrel in that vent up just up to the top to the hand grip there, and what that'll do is allow this mold to open like a hinge around the back, and that'll help it align later on when we go to cast into it. Now, this is also a good time to remember that we'll be pouring this mold using a platinum silicone. For this particular mold, we're going to be using PlatSil Gel 25, which is a platinum cure silicone. So that means we need to be really careful about anything the silicone comes in contact with in its wet or uncured state. So our foam core board, our baseboard, our clay, our straw, our firearm, everything needs to be contaminant free or free of any sulfur or any rubber parts that might inhibit the cure. So like Pachmeyer grips or something like that, any kind of rubbery material, you want to be really careful about and remove those if that looks like it's going to be a problem. And if you are dealing with a situation where you're dealing with a semi-rigid or rubber parts that are part of the firearm that you can't remove, that's a good idea then to do a mold with a 10 cure formula like the 80-30 or 80-15 or 80-40. But real important, remember that we'll be pouring this using platinum silicone, so everything needs to be compatible with that. Now what I've done here is just marked on my foam core board my basic dimensions, and then I'm going to score it along those lines, and then we can easily snap it around those score marks and then bend it to form a rectangular box. This is one of the reasons I love working with foam core board. Now remember, you want to be careful to make this really sturdy. You don't want your foam core warping. If you're dealing with a form that might require a lot of hydraulic pressure from the silicone, it's a good idea to use a box maybe made out of melamine coated plywood. Now what I'm doing here is just cleaning up that little funnel right before I box everything up and pour my silicone. I'm just going around here with a wood sculpting tool to define that edge really good and make sure I've got a clear area to cut that back, because once this is cast, I'll need to cut off that excess with a handsaw or a Dremel tool, and I just want to make sure that that is clearly defined so that'll be easy to do later on. Ideally, since this is going to be a prop and we want to make this fairly quick, we want to be able to turn around copies as fast as we can, so we don't want to have a lot of extraneous cleanup work. Now, we want to make absolute sure that our wet silicone does not stick to our model, especially if we're molding an actual firearm. So we're going to release the pattern with Eject-It 33, which is now called Super Release PTR. On our website, we have it labeled both ways, so it's easy to find. But this is a great release to keep silicone from sticking to metal or glass parts that typically have a tendency to bond. So real important there. Do not skimp on the release. Make sure you apply plenty of release and then give it plenty of time to dry. You want to let that outgas so it doesn't create little gas bubbles on the inside of your silicone mold. So I usually spray that over my pattern and then wait about 20 or 30 minutes before pouring my silicone mold. Now, if you work a lot with foam core board and hot glue, you'll get to know its limitations pretty well. For this type of mold, this is not a problem at all, but when you start getting into larger molds so you don't have your mold box warping, it's a good idea to switch over to materials like melamine coated plywood or MDF board that's been released with petroleum jelly. Now ready to calculate the volume on our mold box and get ready to mix and pour our silicone. Now for this particular part, we had the dimensions came out to 168.75 cubic inches. Now we divide that by 25 and we get 6.75. Now I won't get too much into the math on this particular video, but basically 6.75 pounds is how much silicone we'll need to mix up and pour for this. So we'll get back to that in a minute. I'm going to give it one last little spray of release to release the inside of the mold box, and now ready to mix and pour our Gel 25. Now we're going to use Plat-Seal Gel 25 and Part H hardener for this. Now the Part H is a hardener, which means it actually hardens the silicone and raises the durometer. So in this instance, we're going to use 1,400 grams of Part A, 1,400 grams of Part B, and then 700 grams of Part H, or the hardener. Now the reason we're adding the hardener is Gel 25 normally cures to a 25 Shore A, and we'd like it to be a little bit firmer than that for this particular mold. So by adding 700 grams of the hardener to this, we're going to raise it up to around a 30 Shore A. Now, the maximum amount of hardener that you can add will bring Gel 25 up to a Shore A 40. And for that, you would use 1 part Gel 25A, 1 part Gel 25B, and 1 part hardener. But for this, we're using 1 part A, 1 part B, and 0.5 parts hardener. So for a total of roughly 3,500 grams, or about 7.7 pounds. Now the reason we chose Gel 25 for this particular mold is, one, it's low viscosity, so that means it will vacuum degas easily, and it's fast setting. This has about a 5-minute working time and about a 1-hour demold, so that's ideal for prop making. We can turn a mold around really fast with that. And then, as you just saw with that table earlier, it may be adjusted, so we can adjust the hardness up or down using the hardener or the deadener to soften it. And that's really important if we need to get multiple hardnesses out of the same batch of silicone. Now I'm going to speed this up here. This is me mixing up 2 different batches. The first batch I mixed up was 700 grams of part A, 700 grams of part B, and 350 grams of part H. And again, because this is a fast working time, I'm writing my notes there on the baseboard just so I can keep track of what I'm mixing up, make sure I replicate that in the following batch. And then I'm adding some pigment here. And the reason for the pigment, that's not 100% necessary, but it does help me see when everything is thoroughly mixed. And that's important because Gel 25 is just colorless translucent when you get it. And that just makes it a lot easier to see, especially if you're in a hurry, makes it much easier to see when you have everything mixed up properly. Now, I'm putting that in my vacuum chamber and degassing that, and that's one of the reasons I split this into 2 batches so that I could put this into the vacuum chamber easily and have everything fit. If I put too much in a mixing cup, it's going to overflow. So since this required so much silicone, I wanted to split that up between 2 batches, and that would allow my vacuum chamber to pull a vacuum on half the batch while I was mixing up the second batch. So now I'm ready to pull out that first batch and pour it, and then degas the second batch. And one of the reasons I wanted to show this in its entirety here is just to show that even with a fast setting formula like this, even though this is a 5-minute working time at 70 degrees, there's more than enough time to do this if you have an organized system for how you're going to pour this out. So you can add the retarder component to this to slow it down, but if you've got everything ready to go, it's not that hard to do. And in some cases, you'll find if it's not terribly critical work, a lot of times you could pour Gel 25 without even pulling a vacuum on it and still get great results. So here we're pulling a vacuum on the second batch, and we're ready to pour that in here in just a second. And you'll notice I'm keeping both those mixing buckets separate, and I keep those handy. And the reason for that is later on when it's time to demold this, before I demold it, I want to make sure both those batches have set up independent of each other. Because heaven forbid that one batch set up and the other was off ratio or something, at least now I will know that mistake before I try to open the mold. So real important, hold on to your mixing buckets and use that to check your work. Also, that keeps you from rushing too fast to open a mold that's not ready yet. When you can easily peel that out of the bucket, that's a good indication that you're ready to open the mold. Now again, since this was an airsoft pistol and I wasn't worried about destroying it, I could easily I broke the barrel off of this by pulling it off that baseboard. Now once I've broken that seal at the base, I'm ready to just twist that around, and again, it did break the barrel, but again, a $15 airsoft pistol, no big loss there. But if you are working with an actual firearm, you do want to take care in demolding this. And that's another one of the nice things about a foam core box here and the hot glue construction is that's pretty easy to dismantle around the mold if need be. So now once we've got that baseboard off, we can just tear apart that foam core box. And again, that's where hot glue construction also helps, because if we've got everything hot glued together, it's pretty easy to take it all back apart and still have a good mold inside. So once we tear that open, we are ready to cut open our mold and see what's inside. And again, we're confident everything is cured okay because it's set up at the bottom, it's set up in both those mixing buckets, so we've got a good mold here ready to cut open. And real important, as you might have seen our other videos, for cutting open a block mold like this, I cannot stress enough, you want a really good, sharp X-Acto or scalpel. We do sell scalpels on our website. A good X-Acto will work as well, but it needs to be really sharp, and ideally you need to have someone to help you. So first thing, we want to just trim off any excess silicone with our scalpel. And then we're going to go in and do our famous zipper cut around the perimeter. And remember, we want to keep the bottom of the mold connected because this will work much like a book. So I'm going to make that little zipper cut all the way around except for the back. And once I've got that cut done, I'm going to have Patrick come in here and help me peel this open and cut that apart. So real important, have an extra set of hands. I'm going to spare you all the cutting footage because we've done that in so many other tutorials. So at the end of this video, I'm going to link a couple of other block mold videos that for those of you who haven't seen this process before. So be sure to check that out. But once we cut that all open, and just a quick recap with a graphic, we cut that open all the way up like a book and held that open and cut through that trigger guard area and just opened it up so it would open like a book but keyed on that outside edge. And that's real important so everything aligns later on. And by not cutting it completely in half, we retained that extra little bit of lock just by nature of the back being connected. Now, because this is a simple rectangular block mold, it's easy to put this back together for casting because now all we need is some straight pieces of board and we can strap those on both sides like bookends, and now we have everything properly registered, ready for casting. And we could either use mold straps, which are very difficult to get now, or we could use some electrical tape to secure everything together. Now for our cast, we're going to use some of the jet black casting resin. This is ideal for casting weapon props because it's already pigmented a jet black color. And the TC804, this particular casting resin, this has about a 6-minute working time and then about a 1-hour demold. So that's enough working time for props like this. If for some reason you do need to cast this under pressure, you have more than enough time to get this poured and positioned inside a pressure chamber to pressure cast. So again, the mix ratio for this is 100 parts A to 90 parts B. So for this one, I wanted to mix up more resin than I needed just to make sure I had enough to fill the mold, and I've got some extra molds standing by. So here I measured out 270 grams of part B and then 300 grams of part A. And the reason I did it by weight, I believe this also has a volume ratio of 1:1. The reason I did this by weight is it's always easier, especially if you don't have marked containers. Weight ratio is always going to be more precise. So especially if you're working in small batches, defer to the weight ratio, and that gives you much more consistent results. Now here I'm just pouring in through the pour spout. And again, that allows the air to evacuate up through that tip of the magazine. So as I'm pouring in, the air that is inside the mold has plenty of room to leave by way of that vent on the other side. And that gives me, it's a wide enough pour spout. This is about a 1/2 inch pour spout. So I have a good enough view of what I'm pouring into there that I can make sure when I'm getting close to the top that I can stop the pour. Now I apologize, my animation is reverse of what I'm doing here. So I'm not trying to pour through that little air vent. The vent is actually on the opposite side of where I'm pouring right now. So again, once I fill that up, I can squeeze that a little bit to help evacuate any air bubbles. And again, this has enough working time. If we wanted, we could pressure cast this. But in lieu of pressure casting, I'm just going to slosh this back and forth a little bit. And that's going to help eliminate any air bubbles that might want to accumulate in the trigger guard or at the end of the slide. And then I'm going to top it off with some more casting resin, and then now we wait about 1.5 hours to demold this. Now, earlier I said the demold time was about an hour, but remember when you're dealing with really thin cross sections, you want to give your casting resin plenty of time so you don't distort a perfectly good cast by trying to demold it too early. So when in doubt, wait a couple of hours before you pull it out so that you can be sure that everything is full strength and doesn't accidentally warp in the process of demolding. Now, since this is a jet black resin, that makes our finishing really easy for a weapon prop because most like machine guns and things like that, it would be easy to just dry brush some silver over the top and you're done. Very easy to create prop knives with this material and any other prop weapons that typically start with a blued steel or darkened steel finish. Now, to finish this out, I'm going to paint the grips with some of the rust-colored Great Paint. This is a paint from Sculpt Nouveau that's based off their Prime-It primer formula. So it sticks very well to casting resin like this. So as long as you don't have any release residue, this sticks beautifully to a cast resin part. And then I'm going to follow that up with just some quick dry brushing of some of the Silver B metal coating. And again, very minimal. I felt like I overdid it here for the video, but just takes a little bit of silver. I use a little piece of foam core board to get the excess off my brush and just dry brush some of the edges just so it has that look of a worn blue steel firearm. Now, in addition to casting a resin copy like this, you could also use the same mold to produce rubber copies using some of our castable rubber materials like either the FP series or the CF series casting rubbers or the PT Flex series. All of those are neutral colors that are easy to pigment to use for prop making like this. And of course, as usual, all of the materials used in our video are available on our web store at brickintheyard.com. And if you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to click that bell icon so you're notified whenever we create new content. We'll have some more Matthew Mungle videos coming up soon. And of course, if you click on the left there, I've got a block mold video for you that will go over some more details about creating block molds for those of you new to that process. And on the right, I've got a video specifically about prop making knives using similar techniques. So be sure to check those out. And of course, check out our website, brickintheyard.com, for all your molding and casting needs.